Alright, so this video is going to cover solving equations using roots. So we have two situations. One situation would be if we were taking an even root to solve the equation, and the other situation would be if I was taking an odd root. So within each category, we have two possibilities. So the first possibility is that I'm taking the even root of a positive number. So a good example of that would be if I had x squared equals 64. So I want to solve for x, so I need to undo squaring x. The operation that undoes squaring is square rooting. For instance, if I took 4 and squared it, I'd get 16. And then if I took the square root of 16, I get back to where I started, 4. So squaring and square rooting are just inverse operations. They undo each other. So I'm going to square root x squared, and whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do to the other. So I'm going to square root 64 as well. The square root of x squared is simply x, and the square root of 64, that has two possible answers, because, as we know, 8 times 8 is 64, but negative 8 times negative 8 is also positive 64. So there's really two numbers that give us 64, and that's positive 8 and negative 8. This symbol means 8 or negative 8. So we can kind of write two answers in one compact way. The next possibility is that I could be taking an odd root of a positive number. So for instance, if I had x cubed equals 8. Again, to undo cubing x, I'm going to cube root x. And I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, giving me x, because the cube root of x cubed is just x, equals, there's only one answer here, and that's 2, because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. The same is not true about negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 is negative 8. It's not positive 8. So we don't have the same situation that we had when we took the even root. So the next scenario is if we're taking an even or odd root of a negative number. So we just looked at positive. Here's what happens if we have a negative. So let's say we had x squared equals negative 64. So we would go ahead and take the square root of both sides like we did in the last problem. But what we end up is with a square root of a negative number. As we talked about when we talked about types of numbers, the square root of a negative is not possible. This is an imaginary number because there's no number that I can multiply by itself to give me negative 64. So for this, we would say no real solutions. It is not possible to take the even root of a negative number. That's true for any even root, whether it's square root, fourth root, sixth root, any of them. Something that might be extra credit in the future would be to write it as an imaginary solution. The square root of negative 64 is 8i, as we've talked about. And technically, there's a positive and a negative imaginary answer. So technically, this is the final answer. However, this is the answer that I would expect you to write. Something like this would be extra credit. Now we're going to look at the odd root of a negative number. So for instance, if we had x cubed equals negative 8, I would take the cube root of both sides again, and I would get x equals, as I showed you on the last screen, negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 is equal to negative 8. So x in this case is going to be negative 2. So there's only one answer for the odd roots. Any of the odd roots only have one answer, and it is possible to cube root a negative number. Okay, so just a couple more examples with even and odd roots. So for example, if I took the fourth root, which is even, of a positive 16, this is going to have two answers, positive and negative 2, because 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 16, and negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 16 as well. If I take the fourth root, which is even, of negative 16, this is imaginary. This is not possible because no number times itself 4 times will give me negative 16. If I were to take the fifth root, which is odd, of positive 32, the only number that works for that is 2, because 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 32. If I take the odd root of a negative 32, the only number that works for that is negative 2, because negative 2 times itself 5 times is the only number that's going to give me negative 32. Okay, so if I had to solve the equation x cubed plus 17 equals 132, I need to solve for x first by getting it alone. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 17 from both sides of the equation. This gives me x cubed equals 115. And now that I have the x cubed by itself, to undo cubing x, I'm going to take the cube root, which gives me x equals the cube root of 115, rounding to the nearest hundredth, is 4.86. And because I took the odd root of it, I only have one answer. So that's my final answer. So again, in this example, I want to get x alone. So I'm going to subtract 73 from both sides, pretty much solving how I would any equation, giving me 2x to the fifth equals negative 20. I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I get x to the fifth equals negative 10. And then I'm going to take the fifth root to get x by itself. And the fifth root of negative 10 is negative 1.58. And since I took the odd root of a negative number, there's only one answer, and that's negative 1.58. So I'm going to go ahead and solve this equation for x. I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. I get negative 4x to the sixth equals 40. Divide both sides by negative 4. I get x to the sixth equals negative 10. If I take the sixth root of negative 10, that is not possible. So those are no real solutions, because I cannot take the even root of a negative number. It's not possible. If I wanted to write that as an imaginary number, I would write plus or minus I root 10. That would be a bonus question answer. Okay, so for this one, I want to take the fourth root first in order to get into the x. So I get x plus 3. The fourth root of 362 is 4.36, but since I'm taking the even root of a positive number, I have to put plus or minus because there's really two possible answers. So now I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. I always put the negative 3, in front of the plus or minus. And so really I have two equations here. The first equation is negative 3 plus 4.36, if that's a positive 4.36. And the second equation would be negative 3 minus 4.36, if I look at it as a negative 4.36. So my two answers are 1.36 and negative 7.36. So those are the two answers that I get from that equation.